our organization has to offer. And it harks back to how I grew up. I grew up in a, predominantly Black working class community, New York City suburbs. And one of the things that my parents always wanted to make sure that my sister and I had was access to things that, may have been limited by our zip code. And so just because we lived in a certain area doesn't mean that we shouldn't have access to certain experiences. So especially my mom would take us to a lot of places around the island, beaches and to, the Long Island Game Farm to see, different animals. And while we're driving out to these places, they were pretty far, and it would go through different farmlands and different ecosystems that I wouldn't see around my own neighborhood. And so that was very important in shaping how I related to the natural world and how I got to this place of, this is something that I want to learn more about and eventually become passionate about and have a career path in. And so as I got older, as I got, more in school, if there's any earth science teachers, here's a wonderful story. I had in ninth grade, took earth science, saw a video on plate tectonics. I said, this is what I want to do. I want to do something with geology. And I normally don't tell this story, but it's important because I told my mom, I'm like, I'm going to be a geologist, ninth grade, ninth and 10th grade. And she was very, not concerned, but it was something that she had never heard of. There's nobody in our community that's ever been a geologist. So this idea of doing something that was unknown to our, everybody knows what a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, and all those wonderful things, professions are. But to say that there's someone that looks like me that wants to be a geologist was new and different. And so this sets up this kind of story of being the only one or the only person of color in these spaces when we talk about, when I, going off to college and going off to grad school and doing things that involve the natural world and the environment. And so, that's an important part of environmental justice as well. Where do you see yourself, in these career fields? So going off to graduate school, the book, I'm sorry, I just drew a blank for a second, but the book, Dumping in Dixie, came into my possession. I had gone to a conference and I picked, it was like a prize or something that they gave us in our swag bag. And I read it, and I was always of the mind that education is one of the great equalizers. And studying science is data. It's, either the data is there or it's not. We know that you can always kind of fudge data, but you shouldn't as a scientist. You go through the scientific method, you test things, and then the science is supposed to be out there to help folks. And so while reading reading Dumping in Dixie, where one of the instances is that they're building landfills. I'm taking classes about groundwater and in other things, and it's like, don't build landfills in certain places. And here I'm reading a story where there's, some, ridiculously close amount of depth to the water table from the surface, and the science says don't build there, but yet they're building there because they want to, not have it in a predominantly white neighborhood, and they want to have it in a predominantly Black neighborhood because they want to subjugate that community environmentally. And so that is kind of like when I was like, wait a minute, this is not how we use science, and that was very important to me in figuring out where my career path went. And so once I got out of school and started working, there were two things that really propelled me further for my environmental justice: making sure that communities don't have these issues, And I started looking at my own community, and lo and behold, like, it's always been there. There's been a landfill. There's a landfill still there now, that we still have issues in my hometown. We have industrial parks all around our community. Our community has a cemetery that has lands that they may or may not be taking care of, that isn't part of like the actual active part of the cemetery. And these were all environmental justice issues in my own small community of about 7,000 or 8,000 folks. And so it really started to have me look at, well, that's just one of my community. That's my community there. What about all the other Black and brown communities that exist on the island or in other places around the country? And then the second point is, do you have, or do they have, a representative in their community to notice these things, to be able to explain these things? And so in those early days, I became the de facto environmental person in my community that had to explain all these things. And so where people didn't know exactly what I did, they did know that if there's something to do with the environment or water, come to Zakiya Grant in Wyandanch. And so, at this point, now that was maybe about 20 years ago. And so now, it's important that we continue on those things of making sure that folks are noticing what's going on in their community and speaking up, but also that they have people from the community that are well versed in some of these things. And I continue my career in this because that's part of environmental justice, the idea of being represented and seeing, so that Black and brown young people can see themselves in environmental consulting, in environmental education. And so the best way to do that is exposure in school, or exposure at a young age, whether it be through the classroom or other educational programs. So hopefully that gives you a brief look into where, my journey into environmental justice and what led me to participate in writing this curriculum, and really, being able to kind of put in some of the experiences that I've, gone through in some of the activities. And finding out what your journey or your story is very important to how you begin teaching your students or your audience environmental justice, because it's not just kind of like, well, we're going to look at this and we're going to, learn these words and practice them and memorize them and then go about our way. It's like, what is your, how do you identify with environmental justice? How do your students identify with environmental justice? That's the first part. And then we can get into the nitty gritty of how do we solve this? Because we also don't want this to be stories of victimization or sad stories of being beat down. It's part of the journey, but there's also some wonderful solutions and victories as well. So that leads us to our next activity, and it's really interactive. But before that, I am going to show some, get into one activity for the curriculum before we get into our interactive one. So in order to introduce the idea of environmental justice, we start off with the Limited Resources game, okay? Oh, sorry. We will get into our interactive activity. I apologize for that. Let's back up a little bit. And I ended off the last time with, how do you start off? How do you start, start interacting with your students or your audience about environmental justice? So we're going to jump into some small groups. I have a document that we're going to spend a few minutes reading over. And as you read over, I would like for you to, in your mind, kind of think about these 3 prompts, and I'll read them out loud. What are some of your biggest takeaways from these reading sections? What is the spectrum of EJ experiences amongst your students, or if you have a different audience, your audience? And what does ensuring that we explore this aspect of work important in preventing curriculum trauma and harm? Because again, we don't want to make this all about victimization or pointing fingers. So I'm going to put those in the chat as we move on. I am going to ask that we stay in this whole group for about 3 to 4 minutes to give everyone a chance to read over the document, and I'll put that document in the chat in a second. And then once those 3 or 4 minutes have passed, then we'll jump into our groups to discuss for about 10 minutes. You can discuss those prompts. So let's get that. Let's get that into the chat. Okay. So that is coming right this second. So it is a Google Drive doc. You shouldn't have to be registered, logged into Google to read it. So if I can get a thumbs up from someone, all right, good. I didn't even have to finish my sentence. That's wonderful. So, so for those of you that can read it over, please do. I'm gonna have a little, some fun background music for you to read over. If you can't, once you're in your groups, we'll catch you up. And I'm gonna also throw in those prompts in the chat. And it's basically, what jumps out at you and, what resonates with you. If for those of you who are really, who may be able to not see the chat. All right. So about 4 minutes to read over. So welcome back, everyone. And I believe everyone is back. I think there's maybe a few folks coming back in. I know that was a very short time, and I was able to peek in on one group, and they're having a very interesting conversation. Does anyone want to kind of shed some light on what they talked about in their group? We have maybe a few minutes for maybe 1 to 2 responses, 1 to 2 brief responses before we move on to exploring the curriculum a bit. And you can just kind of jump in, call out.
I can be that one of those people. Sure. We were talking about how this is racial justice, but it's also even maybe more so social economic justice, and how we spent a fair amount. We were referencing the Poor People's Campaign and how we've all learned a lot from that, and how there's a lot of white people that are very, very poor, and we were talking about maybe not sharing, maybe not always being so caught up in this, like some of the semantics of things, but to really listen carefully for shared values across communities of people. But the Poor People's Campaign came up a bunch.
Thank you. And this idea that, economics, and, race can intersect, and that, part of environmental justice is also involves, class justice. This idea that, low income communities of any color are also included in environmental injustice. Is there another kind of a response? Anybody else wanted to add in before we move on?
Kyle and I were in a group alone. This is Jelaine, and we talked about our experiences, but I think the thing that would cover our discussion is that this is a community-based need. It's not something that you can teach for one semester in a classroom and help to think the problem is solved. It's ongoing, it's connecting education, the environmental justice, the big picture has to be throughout the community.
Thank you for bringing that up. There's as if you're a classroom teacher, as a classroom teacher, I always wanted to make sure that I had a connection to the community that I taught in, as far as, it's not just within the four walls. And especially for environmental justice, you want to make sure that you're bringing in multiple parts of the community, multiple parts of your audience's lives, not just during the school day if you're a classroom teacher, but what goes on after your students leave school. There's other parts of their lives that are as equally impactful and that need to be addressed. And so that idea that it's community, it's ongoing is very, very important. So thank you, Julene, for mentioning that. So now that we've kind of like gotten to the idea of where do we have to be in order to start looking at our, looking to teach this, now we can move on to what's in the curriculum. And there's a lot of different things. And, I'm going to try and condense it into such a short amount of time. But I do welcome that you be on the lookout for our longer workshops. Our workshops on environmental justice are anywhere between 2.5 hours to 5 hours. And we still find sometimes that we're running out of time because there's so much to talk about and so much to learn about our curriculum. But we'll do kind of like a quick dive into what's included into the curriculum and why it's included. So I'll go back to some screen sharing. And that first part that we did was called Preparing Your Mindset. And let me make sure I'm properly sharing. There we go. And I'm going to go over a lot of the components in our middle and high school lesson, but we do also have an elementary school lesson, and I'll be pointing out some important parts and components to the environment, the elementary school lesson as well. So for our middle and high school lessons, we usually start off with explaining the idea, the concept of environmental justice through a limited resources game or limited resources activity. And this in our environmental justice timeline are a collaboration between EcoRise and an organization called Groundwork. And so we've made some adjustments for our specific audience, but the idea behind the limited resources game is that your different groups are given certain resources, and they're supposed to build a tall tower. And obviously some groups will have all the things that they need in order to build the tallest tower. And other groups will be given, limited things. Maybe they only have one or two, or, don't have things like tape. And we just use, recyclable materials. And so this idea of also there are supervisors, and there are people who receive lots of help from either a teacher or the person in charge of the group, or there's other people who, other supervisors who are dismissive that, interact certain aspects of either political leadership in the community, or other community organizations or businesses or developers that kind of hinder the idea of getting this task done of building the tallest tower. And so this idea of that some groups have access to a lot more resources than others do. And students can have a conversation about either how they feel about that, or where they see that in their communities, or if they see it at all. And so that really just kind of introduces the concept of environmental justice. And then we get into the environmental justice timeline. And so this is a history of what things have been going on in the United States. And it actually starts with with treaties and broken treaties with indigenous peoples around the country. And so this timeline is important because while environmental justice is like the thing right now, it's important to note that when we're talking about environmental justice, we're really talking about systemic racism, and that has been going on for a very long time. That's why it's called systemic, racism. It's not something that's just happening to this community over here, for a decade or two. It's been rampant throughout U.S. history. And so when we talk about trying to dismantle it, just realize that we're trying to dismantle something that has been around for quite a long time. And so this timeline is very important to let students know that, this is, it's not something that's just happened yesterday, just because they may have heard about it, a little while ago, that it is prevalent throughout US history. Now, like I said before, we do have to get through the tough parts and the uncomfortable parts of, environmental injustice, but there is a portion of victory in celebrating those who have been working with working within the field to make sure that the communities see these victories. And so we have heroes. They are older folks. I know that, when we work with students, we want to make sure that we have folks that are relatable. And we do have some resources where we let students know that there are folks that are similar in age that are working on environmental justice issues. And you can reach out to me for those resources. But we wanted to make sure that we paid homage to folks who have been working on these environmental justice issues. And a lot of them started out as young people and just continued on. And so while we see them as full adults now, they've been working on these issues since their 20s or maybe even before that. And so we have a wonderful EJ Heroes poster set. And as you can see in our logo workshop, we usually ask, our participants to take a look at our environmental justice heroes, figure out, who resonates with you. That's part of the activity in the curriculum. And then this leads to who are the environmental justice heroes in your community. And so students or your audience is really able to identify who's doing the work locally. And so I know it's a lot of information, and we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A in a second. Specifically in our high school lessons, we have our section called Advocating for Environmental Justice that has our different environmental justice scenarios. And so I have an example on the left, which is one of our scenarios called New Roadway. And just to give you a little premise of it, it's about the community having to come together, at town hall. So all of our scenarios revolve around people meeting at town hall to discuss these issues. And in this specific one, they're trying to build a new parkway, a new highway in the community, even though they already have one, and there's some other environmental justice issues. In our longer workshops, we'll have you explore each of the different scenarios. There's 7 of them. There's one that's on water quality that's reminiscent of Flint. There's one about fracking. There's one about landfills. There's one about beautification and green space. Another about community improvement and gentrification. So I do implore that you take a look at those, after the workshop. And then after the students go through those different scenarios, and we've also kind of built in, some nuances, like when do these town hall meetings take place, and who are the different players. We can get into setting, how do we create policy? It could be policy about how we manage getting folks to get this information and be in a town hall scenario, or it can be about specific environmental justice issues. And again, that's on the right-hand side. So in our elementary school lesson, we want to make sure that we're still have the idea of justice, but in a kind of like more compatible way for young students. And when we say elementary school, we're really looking at maybe K through 3rd grade. And so we came up with the idea of just or unjust, and so asking students to take a look at our discussion card, and that would be on the left-hand side, and ask them a couple of questions about what do they think is happening. And that would be a separate card. And so obviously this one, the first one with the garden, would be something that was just. And then having them look at another card. This one is of some dumping and folks throwing trash. This would be an example of unjust. And so with our elementary school students, it's really about tapping into that social emotional learning and the idea of compassion and empathy, and really getting to the heart of those things, and then finally the just and unjust. All right. So that, I would say, is in a nutshell, but it's really just a really abbreviated version of what you would see in a longer workshop. And so at this point, I'm happy to take any questions, especially if you wanted to see some more. And then before that, I do just want to show you where you can enroll. As part of environmental justice and equity, we've made this available for free to anyone. We didn't want cost to be an issue for folks to not have access to our environmental justice lessons. So we made it available, and I'm going to make sure that I'm in the right spot before I share just once again. Okay. So if you go to our website, which is ecorise.org, and navigate to curriculum, you'll see that here's our environmental justice curriculum. It's free. I'm clicking on it. I'm clicking on it. So of course, my computer probably doesn't want to cooperate on the website right now, but definitely when it just does decide to cooperate, maybe I'll get back to it. All right. So we'll continue with some questions. I see a couple of folks have their hands up. There might be some questions in the chat, and I would love for Seth, if you could help me out in navigating some of those questions.
Yeah, definitely. And I was able to put, I think, the direct link to the curriculum on EcoRise website in the chat. But Sylvia, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Seth. And what is your name, the person who was just telling us about the curriculum? Sorry.
Zakia.
Zakia, thank you, both of you. So your curriculum looks so amazing, and I would really like to feature it on my website. I have an association for environmental educators that's statewide in Washington State. And so we like to post resources. And I was just wondering if you have any parameters around how people share your work, or if it's okay for me to just go ahead and do that.
What you can do is you can email me, and I can get our communications people involved. But we're
okay.
on the simple end. If you want to tweet about it, all that social media good stuff, tweet about it. put it on your Facebook group or Facebook page. We have no problems with that, but we can always communicate and see what else we can do to help, you know, to collaborate.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and just drop my email in the chat right now. So just in case anyone does have to run off before we end, they can contact me.
Thank you.
Any other?
Yeah, and Zaki, I don't know if you can see Sarah's point that there's lots of organizations out there that will be collaborating with EcoRise in the future. And so there's lots of opportunities, a wonderful organization to partner and work with. And Pam, go ahead and unmute yourself.
And thank you both for having this. I think EcoRise, you came to our conference in Toronto on November 6th and spoke to our district. So just so appreciative of your work. This is kind of a silly question, but I clicked on the link and found that I'm looking at the high school lesson. Is it just that those are the limited pages showing, but is there also elementary, middle school you mentioned?
Sure. So let me see the link that you so when you get access to the entire curriculum, it has all of the lessons. So let's see if I can share really quickly what it looks like once you get all registered up. So when you get on the website, it'll just say environmental justice, and that's everybody. But let's share. So this is why we have to have a longer session. This is my dashboard. It's got a whole bunch of different things on it. But all of our lessons are housed on Canvas. And so when you get everything all done up, you'll have access to all 3 lessons. Right? So K through 3, 4 through 8, and 9 through 12. And those are just kind of guidelines. You know, some folks are saying that, you know, they're 5th and 6th graders, or their whatever age group corresponds, you know, can do everything in 9th, you know, in the high school version. It just, you know your students, or you know your audience best.
Absolutely. And I see Roberta has the same question that I do, so I'll ask it as well. I have registered before. So do we register to get access to the whole thing versus the 4 pages that were just shown to us?
Oh, so when you have that document that we just saw in the workshop, that's basically just some things that we put together so that people can have ease of access. But that's just the beginning part. It's included in the curriculum, and you have access to, and I'll just show it, you know, again, like the actual lesson plan is, for each one, is about 20 pages.
Right.
But, you know, but if you were to go on there, so here's your background information, that's what we read today. And then if we were to keep going forward, again,
right,
what we read today.
Can I show you what I'm seeing? So maybe you could navigate us, those that are not knowing how to register or get on. Is it possible to share my screen? All right. So this is what I'm seeing. So that was the link that was sent. So I go there, and what I just see is the 4 pages, the 4 thumbnails there. And then it says high school. And then I guess I go to add to cart.
Yep.
Okay. Of course, will take its sweet time because, you know, it's under pressure. It's
Yes.
kind of like photocopiers. As soon as you let them know you're under pressure, they just break down. Okay, and then no coupon needed, proceed to checkout.
And then it'll ask you for some information, and then you'll be able to place your order. You'll be sent a couple of welcome emails, and then you'll be good to go.
Perfect. Okay, that's the missing piece for me. Thank you.
No problem. And that was what I was trying to show when I was on the website, but it, the website was doing its thing, taking its time.
Well, no, love this. We just love this. This is awesome.
Any other questions? I'm trying to.
Hi, this is Nadine Meyer. I do have a question. I work at a nonprofit environmental learning center, and so I just ordered your EJ curriculum. And the question I have is that when students come here for us, we do charge the schools per class when they're joining us. We're nonprofits, that's our way of making money. Are we allowed to utilize this curriculum in that kind of setting where students are coming to us, they're going to pay for a program and it happens to be this program?
That's another excellent question, and definitely that's something that we would have to talk about, because we have some MOUs for some of our other curriculum, because we do work with other organizations for some of our other, like our sustainable intelligence curriculum. So definitely, if you can either give me your information or you have my email address, we can talk, we can talk about that. All right. So I know that there was another question about include community-based activities. And so in our, in the full lesson, and so like I mentioned, like the canvas that I just showed you, well, we've pulled out some of the important parts for ease of access, but if you download the entire like PDF of the lesson, and it is robust, at the end, you'll have some community connections, some suggestions on how to reach out to different parts of the community in order to kind of get that place-based, component to your to the activities that you choose to present to your students or present to the classroom. So hopefully that answers your question. And then as an educator, you're always welcome to, take the information or take some of the activities and put your own spin to it and bring in, some of your local organizations. And so when we talked about our local heroes, well, that's a place, that's the time where you bring your local heroes into your classroom or to your students or your audience.
I see that we have about 1 minute left, and I know folks are needing to run off to other activities. So I want to send out a huge thank you, Zakia, for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it. And I'll send one final reminder that I will be sending the recording, all the resources that we've talked about today, and information on future Teach Climate Network workshops, probably latest Monday of next week. So feel free to stay on, but thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And again, definitely email me if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them, and I can stay on for a few extra minutes. I know, Pam, I think you had a question about the local youth heroes. We have an activity, it's like an unofficial activity of that we use in workshops for youth activists. And so there's a couple of different articles that that highlight youth activists, and we usually do like a jigsaw activity, have participants or students, kind of do a little reading and research about them, and then share out. And so there's a few articles that we definitely use. I can probably put together a couple of resources and maybe forward them out to Seth, who can forward them out to folks.